Another question I wanted to ask you was about what it's like to sail so far offshore that it's inevitable that you get into some heavy weather, and I don't know.
I prefer to be offshore. Rocks are bad.
Rocks are bad, land is bad.
The coast, you know, can be tricky. If you're well offshore, say a few hundred miles, you just deal with it. And yeah, I've had some very heavy weather over the years, and I think it definitely is one of those things that you learn how to deal with it, what the boat likes to do, how to rig it, you know, for the heavy weather. And my own preference with this boat, and it doesn't necessarily apply to any other boat, but the West Sail is a very sturdy boat with a long keel, so she's really good downwind. It goes like an arrow downwind. There's no tendency to broach, you know, to swing broadside to the waves. And I like to keep the boat moving in heavy weather. Even we once went around Cape Horn with what I call a Spitfire jib, which is only 40 square feet. And we were going around the Horn about 7 knots with just 40 square feet of Dacron up.
Wow.
And the boat's very stable under those conditions. Most people think it's the wind that blows the boat, and while the maximum wind I've been in, 150 knots, did blow the mast off the boat, that's unusual. The more common danger comes from waves. Water is a lot heavier than air, and when you get a few thousand tons of water crashing on the boat, there's always damage.
Yeah.
And so you try and avoid that. You try and make sure that you're not in a sailing mode that's causing waves to break on board. But inevitably, when we went around the world via the Southern Ocean, the waves are coming up from behind, and just occasionally, if one of them decides to break just where you are, you have a problem.
Wow. That's happened. You've been hit by big waves.
Oh yeah, it washes away, you know, well, your life rings go for sure, and things like the Aries vein get broken off and stuff like that. Yeah.
Wow. Wow. Can you tell us about what happened in that storm where you lost your mast? And
well, that was a summer cruise. I was coming back from the Caribbean. After trying for a week to get crew, I decided I'd do the trip myself. It's only about 650 miles from Bermuda to New York, and I've done it many times before. So I decided to sail single-handed, which I've done quite a bit over the years.
You were single-handed when it happened.
Yeah, and I could tell from the weather forecasts, which in those days were not digitised or anything. It was all done by voice radio. That there was a front coming through, which is very common. There's nearly always a front somewhere between Bermuda and New York. And just as I got the boat to the north wall of the Gulf Stream, the squall line ahead of the front hit the boat, and things deteriorated very, very quickly. And finally, I got the jib furled, but I had a reef main which I could not get to. It turned out the reason why was that the wind had already blown the Aries away. The plywood vein had gone, so I couldn't let the boat steer itself up into wind. And,
wow.
And I thought I was going to tear the mainsail, so the boat got slowly knocked over till finally water was coming in over that coaming. We were almost horizontal, and suddenly, I mean in a split second, the mast disappeared over the side, and it turned out later on when I examined the debris that a shroud had parted under sheer normal tension, and from the damage to the staysail, which was not set, it was just furled on the boom, and the hook that was holding it down to the port shroud had bent. I was able to figure out by putting it on the testing machine at work to see what the tensile modulus was, that we've been experiencing forces that correspond to 150 knot wind at the time. So it was a meteorological bomb, which are not that uncommon in that part of the ocean between Bermuda and New York.
Yeah.
Quite a few ships have been damaged. There was a tall ships that went down under the same conditions a year or two before, I think.
God.
And, so I was just unlucky in the wrong place at the wrong time.
So when
it was a bad night.
It was a bad night. You were by yourself. Was it
myself,
at night when it happened, or during the day?
Night. Yeah, it was
even
about
better.
1 o'clock in the morning.
So the boat, the boat went over on her side about 90 degrees over.
Yeah, the boat was completely knocked down. Wow. And the strain on the shroud broke.
Wow.
Broke it in. And then as soon as one shroud went, the whole rig collapsed.
And then and you were in the cockpit the whole time?
Well, I was in the cockpit, yeah, and with a wind like that, you can't stand up. I was sort of holding on, and then. Well, many people have asked me if I can cut the remaining shrouds to jettison the mast, because of course it was banging on the bottom of the hull. It didn't sound so good. And the fact is, with winds like that, you can't stand up. I slithered around the deck with some vice grips and pulled the cotter pins out. Let the mast go that way.
Wow.
And believe me, there's nothing like a scared man with cotter pins.
Yeah, pulling the cotter pins out.
Butter, you know.
So then. So you jettisoned the mast, but the storm wasn't over. What?
No, well, by daybreak, the waves. We never did get huge waves. I might say when these bombs occur, the sea doesn't have time to really build up. I mean, there were waves, but mostly it was blowing foam off the water. Wow. It was in a white mist, you know.
White mist.
Yeah. And so the waves were not
Whipping
huge
mist.
because there just was no time for the fetch, you know, to build up. And by about 10ish, I decided to start the engine and see if I could motor slowly. And slowly over the next 2 days, we began to go faster and faster. And finally got home. I did call the Coast Guard and made a pan call to say that I might run out of fuel. And they were, you know, pretty casual about it. They said, well, you know, keep in touch every few hours. And so, as it happened, I had just about enough fuel to get to Fire Island Inlet and get home.
Back to New York.
Yeah, back to New York.
So were you headed for Bermuda originally,
no, I was from
or you were?
Bermuda to New York. Yeah. So I got home, and I rigged. And I get this. This was long before Iridium. This was actually '88 when this occurred. So I tied the dinghy oar to that gallows there, and ran a piece of wire, some spare wire, up to the antenna tuner, and called my wife on the single sideband.
Oh my God!
And said, "Look, I've got a slight problem." I might be a little late.
Wow.
And actually, when I got back to work, my secretary said, she'd of course heard what had happened. She said, "You got 9 lives, you're like a cat." And I said, "Wait a minute." And I counted the number of times I'd nearly flown into a hill in a jet fighter or whatever. And I said, "No, I've got 15 lives actually."
Wow. That's amazing. That's probably the most difficult sailing offshore bad weather event that ever happened.
That was an incident.
Yeah.
I think, as I've mentioned before, that trip around the world via the Capes, via Cape Horn and Good Hope, and where we did get so damaged, we had to go back to Good Hope to Cape Town to get repaired again. So we started once and went back, and a week later we started again because we'd got so beaten up. And that was more continuous, not quite as bad, but more continuous for weeks on end, just reefing the boat, jibing, you know, whatever, to keep the boat moving. And that was in a sense tougher. The crew was so good. I was amazed that they kept up their good spirits and all that under conditions like that, where you're wet all the time.
Wow.
Anything that's cut won't heal. You know, your sores get to be nasty because you're wet. The boat is damp. There's waves crashing on board that finds every damn leak on the boat. You know, and so I was pretty impressed with the crew on that one.
Wow. So the horrible weather, the strongest winds and the dangerous waves. That's not typical. That's rare in your voyaging, right?
No, most of the time you don't have enough wind, I would say. Most of the time you wish you'd been a bit stronger. Yeah, of course people like to talk about the bad weather. It makes good copy, but most times you're jogging along nicely, you know, you say, oh, another few knots would make us go a knot faster, you know. So most times the sailing is very pleasant.